Welcome to the Dr. Pat Show. Talk radio to thrive by. Powerful, inspiring, and coming to you live, bringing you stories of people like you and me, busting through and living life full out. Get ready to dare to wonder what your life would be like if you knew you could not fail.
Hey everyone, I'm Mariangela Maguire and I'm guest hosting today on the Dr. Pat Show. I'm really excited about this opportunity, grateful to her for providing it to me. My regular gig on Transformation Talk Radio is a podcast on Thursdays at noon, 3 Central or Eastern Time, called Nothing But Now. And it's a show where I really focus on the mindfulness journey, trying to help people and always actually, to be honest, helping myself pay attention to how to bring mindful practices into my daily life. There are simple ideas, but they can be very challenging to incorporate into our day. And so we talk about strategies and challenges. And then every other week on the show, I've been doing a new segment called Voices, where I'm trying to bring attention to the relationship between mindfulness and racism. You know, as a white woman, I feel I have my particular obligation to bring to conscious awareness deeply embedded ideas that all of us have about racial inequality and about white racial superiority. And so one of the ways that I'm doing this is that recognition that as a white person, I don't necessarily have a lot of contact with African Americans. And maybe the most information I get is from the media, which means I have a pretty narrow and distorted picture. So what I do every other week is that I've been interviewing people from my life, people I've met through work, through my neighborhood, through volunteer activities, who are African American, people whose lives in some ways are ordinary, just like mine, and in other ways absolutely extraordinary. I simply want to bring to all of us who are white counter narratives, counter to the distorted and narrow view we get from the media. And for Black, Indigenous, people of color, I hope that in listening to these stories, you'll hear stories that resonate with your experience. And again, stories you don't hear enough of in the regular media. So I'm pushing that topic a little bit further today by talking about diversity, inclusion, equity at a really critical moment in our culture and our history. And I'm doing that with my guest, Dr. Diane Goodman. Diane, thank you so much for joining me today on the Dr. Pat Show.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you.
Yes. So Diane is what is Diane not? Diane is a consultant. She's an educator. She's an author. I'm guessing you've been a mentor to many in this space around diversity, inclusion, social justice. And this has been part of your professional life from very early in your professional life. Is that right?
That is right. I've been doing this work in one form or another, mostly as an educator, broadly defined, for over 35 years at this point.
Wow.
And it is work I am still as passionate about and clearly is as needed today as it was when I started.
Exactly. Well, you know, that's a segue to something I've been thinking about quite a bit. You know, you and I are of an age where we can think back, I'm guessing, to our childhood and remember seeing on television in particular violence in the streets, right? Unrest around issues of racial injustice. I remember as a little kid seeing that, and it was scary, wondering what is going on. Seeing people in incredible pain, being treated unfairly for reasons that seemed terribly arbitrary. And here we are, 50 years later, seeing some very similar images. So Diane, as an expert, as someone who's devoted her career to these issues, I just wonder, how are you making sense of the current moment that we're in?
Well, first I want to say I don't feel like an expert.
Okay.
These are issues I've been thinking about and learning about and talking about for a long time, but certainly in no way consider myself an expert or have, you know, the definitive perspective on these issues. And as you said before, being a white woman as I am, you know, certainly that informs my lens on this.
Right.
And I really, as you, try to listen very deeply to Black, Indigenous people of color and what they're saying and what they're experiencing from their realities. But having said that, I mean, it is hard for anyone to be watching the news and not to certainly have a response, and I think we have different responses to it. the one thing that I think is really important that I've appreciated what others have said is how do we not focus specifically on the violence or the some people who are doing the looting, and what is the more important message that people are trying to express.
Okay.
And I think it is easy to get distracted by, and certainly our president is intentionally trying to turn our attention to the violence that's occurring and to exploit that,
Right.
and not talking about what the more important and central issue is, which is racism and racial injustice and racism in the criminal justice system.
Right.
And so I think we need to continue to turn our attention back, in this case, what happened to, Mr. Blake, but also obviously the much larger issues that that's reflective of.
Right. So, in these last few months, when so many stories have been held up as bringing our attention to that systemic racism, and particularly in the relationship between members of the Black community or Black people in America and the police, but that's if I think about the 4 stories that we've talked about the most in the last few months, those are by no means the only ones. So how do you not lose a sense of hope, and that sense that if I'm a person of color, I don't know how I could think that things are getting better. And as a white person, I struggle with that as well. How do you stay positive, or maybe you don't? I mean, how do you deal with the experiences and watching what's happening?
It's a great question. And I'm seeing among my BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, friends and colleagues, a level of despair, anger, frustration that they're saying they haven't experienced in a long time. People who are, and even watching people on TV who professionally talk about these issues, that I think this has taken a tremendous emotional toll on people. So I want to recognize that. And I know just for myself, how deeply despairing and horrifying it is to see what is just happening over and over and over again, knowing that this is the tip of the iceberg, knowing that this is happening all the time that we don't know about and has been. But in terms of the hopefulness, I think this is where history is important.
Okay.
I think history is important for us to understand this is part of a pattern, that this is not, you're referring back 50 years or thereabouts, but clearly we can go way, way back, further than that, since the founding of this country, and about how these patterns of violence against Black people and other people of color have been part of our history and has been used as a way to control and to oppress and to marginalize people. So that's one part of the history that I think we need to be mindful of, that this is part of a pattern. At the same time, we're also part of a history that has fought against this and has waged resistance, and in some very effective ways, because we certainly do have laws that didn't exist before.
Good point.
We certainly do have remedies that didn't exist before. We certainly do have people of color in positions of power where they weren't before. So I think it's important to hold on to the fact that while these patterns of violence and white supremacy and racism have always existed throughout the history in this country, that so also have people who have fought against it. And that includes other white people, that there have been white people who have joined these struggles again throughout history. And so, I do come back to Martin Luther King, the arc of the, I'm not saying this quite right, moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think we need to make sure it bends towards justice. I don't think it just automatically happens that way. But I think big picture, I think things have changed. And in this moment in particular, as people have said, these demonstrations and marches have been bigger than they've been, that they've included more white people than they've ever seen, that people were talking about white supremacy, systemic racism, these big scary words that people haven't talked about before, and really are demanding significant changes. So that is the other piece of the hopefulness, is that I hope we are at a moment in time where we can really take these issues on in a more significant way.
And when we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want us to talk about the distinction between because you were talking about what has changed, and of course I was a kid, but I don't remember from childhood seeing pictures on the street of demonstrations, both peaceful and violent demonstrations, but also of police brutality. But what I don't remember from that time are people really using the language of things like systemic racism, right, of white privilege, of being able to talk about those things in really powerful ways. So when we come back, we're also going to talk about that distinction between what is it to mean to say that I'm not a racist versus being an anti-racist? What's the difference between individual action and more collective action? So, but first we're going to take a break. Folks, you're listening to the Dr. Pat Show. I'm Mariangela Maguire, guest hosting today with my guest, Dr. Diane Goodman. I hope you'll join us after the break. Hi, everyone. I'm Mariangela Maguire. Welcome back to the Dr. Pat Show. I'm guest hosting today, and my guest today is Dr. Diane Goodman, and we're talking about racism in America, systemic racism, and particularly because the two of us are white women, we want to address and talk about this in the context of our responsibilities. And one of the things Diane and I have been talking about is what's different today than, say, 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 150 years ago, or gosh, we could keep going back, couldn't we, to the experience, the reality of systemic racism in our culture. But one of the things we've been talking about that's different today is some of the language that is more widely used, that people are talking more openly about things like white privilege, and systemic racism. And one term that's used quite a bit more, although Angela Davis first talked about it maybe 50 years ago, was the difference between saying I'm not a racist versus I'm engaged in anti-racist activity. And there's a recent book that came out, I think maybe, Diane, maybe 2 years ago. Ibram X. Kendi wrote the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, very popular and a resurgence in popularity in these last few months. And he really talks about that distinction. And I would say maybe what I glean from that difference is active versus passive. Right? I can passively be and say, oh, people say things like, I don't see color, which is problematic, or I treat everyone the same, which is unlikely if we do a deep dive into our behaviors. But to say that I'm actively engaged in activity that undermines systemic racism in our culture. So would you talk about that distinction and how you see it playing out and its usefulness or its limitations in the current moment?
Well, I think it is useful, but I may take a broader definition of it than Ibram Kendi does, with all respect to him, and it's a wonderful book, and I encourage people to read it.
Yes.
That I think being anti-racist can take many forms.
Okay.
His emphasis is on changing policies and practices, which is absolutely critical. And if we're not engaged in changing the systems, the racist systems that are being oppressive, then, we're not really being actively anti-racist.
Okay.
I think we can be anti-racist on multiple levels. We know that in order to be anti-racist, we need to be informed. And so are we also actively educating ourselves and actively educating other people about racism, so we can be making the kind of changes that we need to see happen? So I think it can happen on more individual and interpersonal levels, as well as on institutional levels and largest societal levels. I think all of those aspects are important, with the larger goal of we need to be changing the systems and the ideology and the belief systems behind them that keep the system in place.
Okay.
And I also wanted to wanted to speak to what you were saying about that language is being used now. And so on one hand, when you asked me about hope, that is giving me hope, because that is a way that we are moving away from just seeing racism as individual prejudices. So as a white person, I may have biases or prejudices against a person of color. And we're recognizing when we talk about systemic racism or we talk about white privilege,
Mm-hmm.
or we talk about white supremacy,
Mm-hmm.
which is really about systems in which white people are seen as superior to people of color and have access and resources and opportunities that are given to white people that people of color don't have. And things that are associated with whiteness and being white are valued more than what's associated with people of color. And so when we take a more systemic analysis as opposed to a personal analysis, that then allows us really to look at
Mm-hmm.
these systems that have operated since the start of this country. We can also talk globally, but certainly in this country, and exists now. The danger that I find as an educator
Mm-hmm.
is that people are learning the terms
Mm-hmm.
and so can sound more woke.
Uh-huh.
We know there's this whole phenomenon of wokeness and
Right.
woke Olympics. And so people now can use these terms and, talk about white privilege and talk about white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
But if it stays at the level of talk without really reflecting on what it means for them, and I'm speaking about white people, what it means for us in terms of being white and what it means for how we show up in the world and what it means for what we're doing to dismantle these systems, then it stays at a talk level and people get to feel good about themselves, but they're not really being anti-racist, back to your original point.
Okay. There's so many things I want to ask you about, so I'm going to start here. In your work as an educator in particular, you were talking about with our obligation to educate ourselves as whites. And if I think about my own high school, college education, it isn't that I didn't learn about about slavery. It's that I know now from more current reading how little I learned, and how little I learned about the consequences, and that I think there is a way in which, for many of us, that kind of education stops a little bit at the Civil War, like, hey, the Civil War happened, enslaved people were freed, everything else now is on them, right? And so, for instance, for me, when I read a book by Isabel Wilkerson, I think The Warmth of Other Suns, I had a completely new understanding of what it meant to be Black in the South and to be Black in America post-Civil War. So in your experience as an educator working with people in all different kinds of situations, what's the biggest gap for whites in their understanding? And so that, what's the biggest gap that you notice people have in their knowledge?
Well, I think certainly history
Mm-hmm.
and cumulative advantage and disadvantage.
Mm-hmm.
People often look at the current reality and they be like, yep, some things seem unfair.
Right.
But it's individualized. So it's either that there were individual people who were mistreating people of color,
Mm-hmm.
and so see it on an individual level in that way, or, well, really, if people just tried hard enough, there's
Right.
the blaming the victim. If people just tried hard enough or valued education more,
Mm-hmm.
or worked harder or didn't rely on public assistance or whatever those mythologies are, then they could make it too. So it's this myth of meritocracy. It's the myth that we have a level playing field.
Mm-hmm.
And one way I find to dispel that is not only to have current, more accurate information,
Right.
but to understand that all the ways that white people have been advantaged throughout time that now show up in our current reality, and all the ways people of color have been systematically disadvantaged
Mm-hmm.
that shows up in our current reality.
Okay.
And just, one example that I think highlights this well that people talk about is even if we just look at post-World War II and access to housing,
Mm-hmm.
and who is able to get mortgages and move into the suburbs, and could buy homes, and accumulate wealth in their homes, which is where most white people have gained their wealth. And that also then meant access to transportation, which meant access to jobs.
Right.
And so there's been all this accumulation of ways that white people have had advantages that then gets passed on. And for, Black people in particular, and other people of color who weren't able to get mortgages, and in fact were redlined, couldn't move into neighborhoods,
Right.
and were funneled into urban environments where there weren't services, there wasn't transportation, couldn't have access, not access to healthcare. We see that now with the pandemic. of who is
Right.
living in environments where there's access to healthcare, or there's more environmental racism, they're living closer to more dangerous plants and transportation output, the pollution. So I think that to me is critical. And I am doing more and more of that in my own learning, because like you, I didn't learn a whole lot of stuff growing up. And it's really helping people see this trajectory. Because I think without that, I think it's impossible to make sense of our current realities without having that more historical cumulative advantage and disadvantage perspective.
I think that's such a powerful statement that it's hard to make sense of what's happening now if you don't know that, because it does just seem kind of bizarre. Not the behavior of African Americans, I don't mean that, but it's hard to, well, I'll just give you an example. So in Richmond, there was the Monument Avenue, and I saw an advertisement for that housing development that was run, I guess, in the 1920s. And it says absolutely explicitly, nothing subtle about it. These homes may not be sold to Negroes, was the word that they used, nor if you buy one of these homes, may you sell it to, again, the word that was used, Negro. There was nothing, as I say, it's not subtle, it's explicit, it was legal, it was, and so as you say, if I don't understand some of the real things that happened, that historical stuff, it just all seems happenstance, right? And I can't make sense of the incredible disparity without knowing that history. But it can also be pretty overwhelming.
And if I could just say about the happenstance, I think what gets even more dangerous than the happenstance is the victim blaming, is the saying it didn't just happen, but there's something wrong with these people.
Exactly.
And so it feeds into, again, that ideology about white people are somehow better than people of color. And that also just gets so dangerous.
I think there is that tendency to say, well, if I was in that situation, I would have made different choices. And that comes from, I think, not really understanding that situation, all of the factors that went into why people live where they live, why they have the schools they have, et cetera, whether it's the advantages I had or the disadvantages that someone else had that were systematic, routine, really. So I'll say, personally, the more I know about that, a feeling that comes up that I think is challenging is shame. So I think we're ready to take a break. We're going to take a break. And again, I don't want us to just focus on the individual level. We're also trying to talk about this in terms of public policy, but I really want to come back and say, how as a white person do I get out from under that paralyzing shame to do something useful, right? Because I think that we can be overwhelmed by it and then we don't do anything helpful. So anyway, we're going to take a break. My guest is Diane Goodman. You're listening to the Dr. Pat Show, and we'll be right back. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Dr. Pat Show. I'm Mariangela Maguire, and I am here with my guest, Dr. Diane Goodman. And we're talking about the current state of and the challenges and the protests, the police brutality, the police violence that we're seeing in our culture right now around issues of race. And it's not a new topic. It's not new to either one of us, but it is a critical topic. And we're really talking today in this conversation about, as white women, the role and the responsibility that we have to educate ourselves, to be engaged in anti-racist work, as opposed to the more passive approach to simply saying, I'm not a racist, I don't see color, and hoping that our moral goodness that we might believe we have is enough. But we've been talking about what it means to educate ourselves, to fill in all of those gaps with the reality of laws, practices that were on the books that allowed for a systematic advantaging of whites over Blacks in America, and Blacks and other people of color. And what I was saying before the break, Diane, is that I found that educational work that I've done in my own life, the reading I've done, very helpful but at certain points kind of overwhelming in the feeling of shame that comes with it. I heard, I think it was actually Isabel Wilkerson who had this analogy recently about that habit as whites that we sometimes have in this country of saying, hey, I was not a person who enslaved other people. I didn't invent redlining laws. Look, I'm not responsible for this. And she said, it's like when you buy a house. When you buy a house, you have to deal with the problems. You have to deal with what it is you purchased. And in a way, as whites, we are this is the culture that we own. It's ours too. And we have to deal with what's come up. But, I can walk away from it. I have that privilege as a white person to simply walk away. And I think if I feel overwhelmed and shamed, I'm more likely to do that. So how do you talk to white people, about managing their discomfort, the shame, the frustration, the overwhelmedness that they might feel in the face of all of this knowledge and information?
Yeah, and I encounter that a lot. I mean, I've certainly have experienced those feelings myself, and I certainly hear, as I work with other white people about that whole range of feelings. And I think it's important to acknowledge them. I think it's important to acknowledge the emotional dimension of doing this work.
Okay.
That I think there's an intellectual dimension. Clearly, we need to learn a lot of things, and that's an ongoing process. But this is not simply intellectual work. It is emotional work. And part of the work of anti-racism and of liberation is about being in touch with our feelings. I think when we numb out, which is, I think, what we are often expected to do and need to do to continue to function in the world that we have, especially if we're start to become aware of the depth and breadth of racial injustice. The way we cope with that is to just numb out and pretend it doesn't matter and shut down our empathy. And so I think being in touch with our feelings is a way that we unnumb and can in fact be in the service of us feeling more called and motivated and engaged in anti-racism work.
Okay.
But the trick is, as you say, is not to get mired in them.
Right.
So I think there's one piece, and you talk about how mindfulness is something that, that you do a lot of work with, and I do some work with it as well. And that is certainly one tool, is to have skills around mindfulness, is to notice, is just notice what's happening to us without having to be attached to it. So I think, or having places where we can talk about those feelings and express those feelings, whatever they are, so they have an outlet.
Okay.
Having said that, we need to find a way to not get caught in those feelings and to use them as a way to move us forward in doing this work.
Okay.
And one way is around the shame, is recognizing that while my family personally did not own slaves, that I have certainly benefited from this system. I mean, there's no way about it. Historically, I have benefited. My parents bought a house in the suburbs when my father came back from the Korean War, from the GI Bill. So, I can't ignore that I am the beneficiary of laws and policies that I may not have been around for, but that I'm a beneficiary of, and certainly currently I am as a white person. So I don't think it's about feeling shame about that, because again, it's not something that I necessarily wanted or asked for, or it might be things that my ancestors did, that it wasn't my decision.
Right.
But for me, what's more important to think about is, okay, so what are the remedies? What are the reparations? What do I do to make things right? If the shame is because of things that were wrong, what do I need to do to make things right?
Okay.
I think that's where, if we can use our feelings to fuel our anti-racism actions, then I think that is a productive way to both recognize and utilize what inevitably comes up for people.
Okay. And in your work, what are you seeing that is effective? What is the anti-racism activity that makes a difference, either for changing the hearts and minds and behavior of whites, or of helping to create a more just world or culture?
Well, I've yet to find the magic,
Right.
the magic activity,
Uh-huh.
but some things that I find helpful.
Hmm.
And it depends on where people are at in this journey. You
Okay.
know, is it white people who have never even thought about being white, who
Right.
have very little understanding of race and racism, you know,
Hmm.
or is it people further on, you know, down the journey,
Hmm.
and sometimes problematically think they know it all,
Sure.
but, you know, still have some learning to do, as we all do. So as I said, history, I think, is critical, understanding history, because
Hmm.
some of it is just people don't have the knowledge. And without the knowledge, you come to, and if you just hear things from mainstream media,
Hmm.
that's a really distorted view. And I think that does not help people see that there's a problem and lead them in a direction of how they can be anti-racist. Again, going back to basically people just worked harder, you know, where they're
Right.
just being violent and they got to stop being violent. So I think a sense of history, a sense of analysis about why are we seeing what we're seeing, what are the historical legacies and antecedents. So
Hmm.
I really feel like information
Hmm.
is one piece that can be very helpful.
Okay.
As I said, another piece that's helpful is just giving people the space to talk about how they feel, talk
Hmm.
about that shame, talk about feeling overwhelmed, that sense of being alone with it. And it's like, wow, other people have these feelings too. It's not just me.
Where would a person go to do that, to share those kinds of feelings? What are some strategies for that?
Well, now more and more,
Hmm.
there are spaces called white caucuses, white affinity spaces, white
Okay.
accountability spaces, workshops geared for white people around racism. So
Okay.
those have been around for a long time. I've been doing them for a long time, but right now there's been an explosion of them, I think,
Okay.
given the moment we're in the
Right.
interest. And so, you know, looking for, are there any spaces now? They're happening online, so it doesn't even need to be in your community, but
Right.
even online, people are offering spaces for white people to do some of this personal reflection work and sharing work. So that's one place. And sometimes it's just find a friend, just
Okay.
find somebody else who you can
Hmm.
have this conversation with,
Hmm.
or do some reading together with,
Ah.
and then, you know, process, you know, what comes up from that reading. So
Hmm.
it can be in a more formalized way, or if
Okay.
people can't find that, a less formal way.
Okay.
Um,
And I'm trying to imagine a person going into one of those groups and really talking about, for instance, my experience is that I grew up in a family, I think very different from yours in some ways, because I've read a little bit in an article you wrote about your family was very progressive in its politics. Mine,
actually not.
no? Oh, okay.
They
Yeah,
are
you have
not.
these sense that okay, I'll just say it this way. I grew up in a family where people use racist language kind of commonly. I think I took the message from your article that your family wasn't like that.
Well, I didn't get the overt. So
Okay.
I didn't grow up in an overtly racist family
Okay.
at
All
all,
right.
but they were
So,
not particularly progressive politically.
oh, okay. Different. That's a different thing, isn't it? Yes. So I think that that's one of those things that I could imagine talking about in a group, or maybe I never could, right? That it
Mhm,
would just be so uncomfortable to admit that my family was like that. But I
mhm,
imagine a lot of people's family. I've
mhm.
certainly
Yeah,
heard that from students over the years, right? Yeah.
yeah.
But do
So
people talk about things that hard and that unpleasant in those
oh,
kinds of
yeah,
groups? Okay.
absolutely. And I think that's part of breaking the silence and breaking the numbness,
Mm-hmm.
is to be able to say that. Because the more we try to hide and protect,
Mm-hmm.
the more we're shut down. And it
Mm-hmm.
gets hard to open and learn and grow. So we need to let go of that defensiveness, so we can be more open to change. Because I
Okay.
do believe, and as I do this work, is that people do want to experience their full humanity and connect with other people in their full humanity. And so I believe that we both have the potential to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a desire to do that when we can strip away, you know, so many of the other things that have shut us down and made us afraid and made us ashamed.
Okay. And I think having that language of racism embedded in our consciousness is a source of shame. And but I hear what you're saying too, is that we're always going to have a kind of defensive reaction to conversations about systemic racism until we allow ourselves to sit with that discomfort of, yeah, that language is in my body in a way. And it doesn't mean I use it. It doesn't mean I promote it, but it even feels ugly just to know that it's there. But if I want to, as you say, have an open heart to really hear other people whose experience is different from mine, I have to allow myself to just live with those feelings a little bit and not get mired down or lost in them.
Right. And another really important distinction I make is that it's not about like our personal blame for having heard and knowing those things that we've heard and learned.
Okay.
That we are all socialized by the larger society, by the media and by what we've learned and not learned in schools, as well as our particular families and communities. We didn't have control over that socialization and that cultural conditioning. So that's not our fault that, you know, we can name the racist stereotypes. That's in the air that we breathe. And some of us to more degrees than other.
Right.
So to me, it's not about the personal blame. It's like, okay, I was socialized this way. Now I can unlearn it. Now I can choose to act differently. And so it's that sense of agency to do something different, not the sense of I'm a bad person because I've learned or heard these things. And the last thing I'll say about that is also that I have benefited whether or not I wanted to. So again, I don't need to be a racist person and think, oh, I should be treated better than a person of color. That's how the system is set up. Right. So I can acknowledge how I benefit from the system, even if I think it's unfair and not right, because that's the system we live in. And I can then say, so now what do I do to change this system or not take advantage of this system? So I can create a more just world that's more aligned with who I want to be and what I want to see.
Okay, thank you. I think that's just incredibly helpful. So we're going to take our last break. And when we come back, I'd really love to hear from you about what would you like people to take away from this conversation of one or two things that you would hope that they would read or do or avail themselves of. And we'll be right back after this break. Hi, everyone. I'm Mariangela Maguire, and you're listening to the Dr. Pat Show. I am guest hosting today, and my guest is Dr. Diane Goodman, and we're talking about inclusion, equity, systemic racism, and what the challenges are for whites to actively engage in anti-racist work. Diane, if someone wanted to get more information from you, learn more about your work, what's the best way to contact you?
I have a website, which is www.dianegoodman.com. And it has a variety of things that I've written, as well as, you know, more background about what I do.
Okay. And you do consulting work. Do you do that with what kind of organizations, people? What's that work towards, or who's the audience for it?
So I work with a wide range of organizations. I do a lot of work with nonprofits, philanthropies, at universities and schools, faith organizations, community groups. So mostly those kinds of organizations, and really individuals and institutions who really want to look at how to create more equitable and inclusive environments where everybody can thrive. And that's really what trying to create.
Okay, that's great. So when we left off, we were talking about the experience white people have around educating themselves about racism. And one of the ideas that I've read about in your work that I think is very interesting is the idea that there are, I think we tend to see it as zero sum. If I give up some of my privilege, or if other people, Black, Indigenous people of color have more rights, more privileges, somehow I'm going to lose. How would you address that kind of feeling or thought process that I might have as a white person?
Yeah. I think one of the things for me that has really sustained my commitment to this work, and I know I'm not alone because I interviewed other people and I wrote about it in a book actually that I wrote called Promoting Diversity and Social Justice, Educating People from Privileged Groups. And that's what do we gain by unlearning racism or other forms of oppression when we're part of privileged groups? How are we harmed by these systems of oppression even while we benefit? And why is eliminating racism as a white person liberating for me as well as it is clearly for BIPOC people? And I think that shift from simply seeing it as we're going to flip the system. So now white people are going to be oppressed and BIPOC people are going to be in charge and oppress us. Clearly, why would we want to do, why want to support that? Or does it address what I think the bigger issues are of how do we eliminate systems of domination? How do we create a world in which everybody has access to the needed resources and opportunities and safety, so everybody can be in their full humanity and can thrive and be well? That to me is the vision I'm going for. And I know there are many other people also who share a commitment to social justice and to liberation. It's a world that works for everybody. And so in helping people envision that, I do work, especially with white people, about what are some of the ways we're harmed by racism. That clearly we are benefited. Let me be very clear, and I hope I've been clear.
Yes.
Racism was set up to benefit white people, and we are, and we have been. And there are ways in which we can also have costs of that system. I mean, as I said, cost to our humanity, how much we need to shut down, so not to really pay attention to the racism and violence that's happening. I mean, I talk to people all the time about all the social discomfort, about awkward around other people. I don't have friends of people of other races. I don't know what to say when I'm with different people. So there's all sorts of social awkwardness. But I think in our society, we have more violence that impacts all of us. Because of unrest, because of injustice, that we spend lots of money on services that are needed because of inequities, social services and substance abuse services that I think are a result of inequities, that we can't work together across differences for things that affect us all, like environmental issues or health issues. So I help people think about kind of the whole range of ways in which there are costs to people, white people, of racism, even while we're benefiting. And what we can gain by doing this work, of feeling a greater sense of authenticity and wholeness, and have a much more diverse and interesting life, and more connections. So that's one way to mitigate the sense of this is a zero-sum game.
I think that that's such a powerful statement, because it both incorporates what is the individual cost to me, how is my humanity undermined by, what is it, Du Bois, who just described the wages of whiteness, right? That what is the cost to my soul from being advantaged by this system and doing nothing to address it. But also you list all of those kinds of social policies that people tend to criticize. Do we spend too much money? Is it causing the national debt, right? All of that kind of talk we have about what are they doing with my tax money. My goodness, if we lived in a more equitable society, we would be able to make such different choices with those resources. So it's not just an individual cost, it's a huge social structural cost as well. That we are allowing. And it just really does raise that fundamental question, is it really worth it to me to hold on to my white privilege, given all of those costs, not just to Black, Indigenous people of color, but to whites as well? I think we too rarely talk about it that way.
And there's a piece of the reality of it does mean sharing power. I mean, it will mean needing to make some changes. And so, I use the analogy of if, there's a cake and you're used to getting, if there are 10 people and you're used to getting 9 of the slices, and now you get 1 slice, but that's equitable, it's going to feel, oh, what happened to all my cake? This is I'm going to starve, when in fact, all it is making it equitable, making sure that everyone is getting a piece of cake. And so there will be ways in which white people have had disproportionate power, disproportionate access to resources, that there will need to be adjustments that people will experience as things taken away. But I think the bigger picture is, it doesn't mean that people are going to then be unable to live a good life. And it will also be knowing that other people will be able to have good lives. And I think if all of us are living good lives, then I think we all benefit from that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think there's so many different ways to find an analogy that helps people understand this, but I just think about in our own families, when our whole family is well and whole, everyone feels better, everyone is happier, and so the human family, we would all benefit from this. Diane Goodman, Dr. Diane Goodman, you have been a wonderful guest today, and I am so grateful to you for joining us. Is there one resource you would encourage people to look at before we go? Like, what's the most helpful book I know there's a million of them, but right now, is there one thing you would encourage people to read or watch or look at?
Oh, there are so many phenomenal resources out there that
Okay.
I can't even begin to say one, but I
Okay.
really want to highlight their voices of people of color, of BIPOC people.
Yes.
And I would
Start
point
there.
people in those directions.
Okay, start there, yes. And just as a mindfulness person, I would say Ruth King's book, Mindful of Race, is a great resource if you're interested in this in the context of mindfulness. And my show, if you want a little more Mariangela Maguire, is Nothing But Now on Thursdays at noon, 3 Eastern time. Diane Goodman, people can find you at your website, dianegoodman.com, if they would like to learn more about your work and be in touch with you. Thank you again for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. A pleasure talking with you.
You too. Okay. Thanks, folks, for listening to the Dr. Pat Show on Transformation Talk Radio.